Hi everybody and welcome back to another HIS TV video with me, Mr. Perkins. What I'm going to do today is I want to talk you through the Catholic challenge to Elizabeth I's religious settlement, which came out in 1559. And this really is more addressed to those students who are doing the edXL GCSE History Early Elizabethan England unit, but may well be useful if you are just a general student of any of the kind of Elizabethan period, looking at her religious policy and reactions to it. So what we're going to do today is just have first of all a quick reminder of what the religious settlement actually was, and then we're going to look at basically how and why England's Catholics reacted to it, and also the foreign reaction, because it's worth bearing in mind that, of course, at the time, outside of England, you've got the papacy, the Pope in Rome, and you've also got France and Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, who are, of course, Europe's foremost powers, foremost Catholic powers as well. And their reaction to Elizabeth's religious policy is going to be really, really important going forwards. So on this first slide here, I've just got a reminder of what the religious settlement actually was. So it was basically made up of 2 acts of parliament, 2 laws that set out how religion was supposed to be practiced in England, but also the structure of the church in England as well. So on the one hand, you have the Act of Supremacy, which basically stipulated Elizabeth was to be the supreme governor of the Church of England. Now, you'll remember from my last video, hopefully, that Catholics quite liked that, because it carried with it an implication, a suggestion, if you like, that Elizabeth was not the head of the church. Actually, the Pope remained the head of the church overall. But of course, in practice, Elizabeth really did look after the church in England. And also all clergy, all bishops, archbishops, priests had to swear allegiance to Elizabeth herself. On the other hand, you have the Act of Uniformity. Now remember, what is a school uniform? A school uniform means we all look the same, we all dress the same. And in the same way, the Act of Uniformity was meant to establish that the appearance of the churches throughout all of England is meant to look broadly the same, and the form of services was to also be broadly the same. So just a reminder on the right-hand side there of the kinds of things that were to be expected in churches throughout England. So churches retained a relatively Catholic feel to them. You still had ornaments, you still had some decoration, hymns and organs were allowed, priests were to wear surplices, but there were some reforms brought back from the days of Edward VI. So the Bibles and church services and the Book of Common Prayer were all to be in English. But one thing that again did placate the Catholics was that the Book of Common Prayer's wording was deliberately ambiguous. And what this meant was that both Catholics and Protestants could then interpret the wording of the Book of Common Prayer in a way that they saw fit. So again, that was something that could aim to placate both groups. And also, in terms of enforcement, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail later on, non-attendees were supposed to be fined a shilling, which I think equates to around a week's wages for people in the lower classes, servants, labourers, and that kind of those kind of folk. So in terms of the actual impact of the religious settlement itself, most people in England in 1558, 1559 were Catholic, with a strong Protestant minority, and most people did accept the settlement, and they continued to attend church every Sunday. There was some backlash. You had the Catholic recusants, so these were Catholics who chose not to go to church services, and they continued to have Latin Mass in their own homes usually. And there would, in the long term, be some plots and revolts against Elizabeth, usually in support of Mary, Queen of Scots. More immediately, all but one of the bishops actually resigned in the face of the religious settlement, but they were immediately replaced by Protestant bishops by Elizabeth. But it wasn't just the Catholics that opposed the religious settlement. You had some Puritan opposition as well, in particular over vestments, which is what priests wore, and over crucifixes as well. Just a reminder that a crucifix is an image of the cross that has Jesus upon it. But as I talked about before, Puritan opposition was relatively weak. It didn't really ever amount to much. So, as I said, the main focus of today's video is on Catholic opposition. And what we're going to look at is basically, on the one hand, what evidence there was of Catholic opposition, but also why Catholic opposition was in the end quite limited, and why perhaps until the 1570s and 1580s we didn't really see anything of real significance. So, key thing to remember is that in 1559, when the religious settlement came about, most people in England are still Catholic. Okay, so and as a result of that, the religious settlement did carry potential for mass opposition. There was always the risk that when the religious settlement was brought about, that all of England's Catholics could rise up and say that we don't accept this, we're going to get rid of Elizabeth and bring in someone different. But actually that never happens. But as I say, I'm going to talk later on about why most Catholics accepted it. For now, I want to focus on the evidence of Catholic opposition. So, immediately, more or less, all but one of Mary III's Catholic bishops resigned in protest. But Elizabeth relatively easily replaced all of those that resigned with Protestant bishops. So that wasn't a huge problem necessarily. You also had a group of people that we call the recusants, and the recusants were people that basically refused to attend these new church services. But really, the recusants were limited to more or less the nobility, and approximately 1/3 of the nobility were recusants. So what this does show is actually the majority of the nobility were either Protestants or were Catholics but continued to go to church. And in the long term, after 1569, Elizabeth would later face plots and revolts against her, led by Catholics. So, for example, the real plot against Elizabeth was the revolt of the Northern Earls in 1569, and then you have the Ridolfi, Throckmorton, and Babington plots later in the 1570s and 1580s. But I think one thing that's worth bearing in mind is the timeline here. You can see in the bottom right there that Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin and heir apparent, who was a Catholic, it wasn't until 1568 that she arrived in England. So is it any surprise that the first major plot against Elizabeth is in 1569, the year after? Perhaps not. But I think this summary on the right-hand side by the history teacher Barbara Mervyn, I think, is pretty spot on in her interpretation, where she says that by 1568, about 10 years after the religious settlement, Elizabeth's policies seemed to be working. The early problems caused by the settlement seemed to be fading. The majority of Catholics outwardly conformed and, without any leadership from the Pope, were politically loyal. In other words, they remained loyal to Elizabeth. So let's be clear here, in summary, there was Catholic opposition, definitely. And I think any exam question you have on this is worth definitely talking about that. But I think I would argue, and I think Barbara Mervyn also argues, that Catholic opposition was quite limited. So let's have a look at why that was. In fact, bear with me. First of all, we're going to look at why English Catholics largely accepted the religious settlement, and then we'll look at the foreign attitudes as well. So I would argue that there are 4 key reasons why most Catholics accept the religious settlement after 1559. So they are leadership, first and foremost. So for me, the fact that Elizabeth called herself Supreme Governor, not Supreme Head, is quite important, because, as I've said before, it carried the implication that Elizabeth saw herself as somebody who was looking after the church in England, but in reality, that the Pope was still the head of the church. As I said before, realistically, the Pope was no longer in charge of the church in England. It was Elizabeth herself, but nevertheless, this measure was something that aimed to placate Catholics, perhaps quite successfully. But also, after Henry VIII having been head of the Church of England, and of course his son Edward VI being head of the Church of England, people in England were now quite used to the idea that the monarch could be head of the church rather than the Pope. This is not a novel idea anymore. People were quite used to it. So leadership was a factor in why most ordinary English Catholics accepted the religious settlement. A second reason is enforcement. It could be argued that enforcement was relatively lenient. So although the religious settlement did stipulate that there should be fines for those that didn't attend church services, fines were actually really only for persistent non-attenders. And somebody could get away with perhaps not going to church on off occasion. But also, Elizabeth was not like her half sister Mary I. You might already be aware that Mary I, or Bloody Mary, she was nicknamed, executed somewhere in the region of around 300 Protestants. Elizabeth never really went down that path. She was never somebody who was going to persecute people for their beliefs. And she was quoted often by many history teachers as saying something like, I don't perceive windows into men's souls. And what she was basically saying is I'm not really that bothered about the denomination or the religion that you follow, as long as you are loyal to me. And I think that was the key thing there. A third key reason is nationalism. So after the war with France, which finished in 1558, 1559, and of course at this time we've also got growing hostility towards Spain. In England, there's pretty little enthusiasm for connections with Catholic Europe. And Elizabeth, with her religious settlement, is beginning to create something that's quite uniquely English. You've got an almost unique Christian church in England, and the people of England, and particularly the Catholics, actually want to start following this because they don't have that same desire for connections with Catholic Europe, with the French or the Spanish or with the Pope. They would prefer something that is uniquely English, and we're going to look at the features of the religious settlement again later. In fact, we can see it here because although the religious settlement made the Church of England a Protestant church, it retained many Catholic features in its appearance and its organisation. So you still had the archbishops and bishops helping the monarch to run the church. Priests continued to wear ornate vestments. You still had stained glass windows. So if you are a Catholic in England, the only real major changes when you're going to church on a Sunday is that you don't have a Latin Mass, and that the services are done in English, the Bible's in English, the Book of Common Prayer is in English. But the church itself still looks relatively Catholic, and you can still continue to interpret the wording of the Book of Common Prayer through a Catholic lens. So I think these four reasons together help to explain why many English Catholics accepted the religious settlement. And what's the key piece of evidence they did? Well, the vast majority of English people continue to attend church every Sunday. And as I said before, what is the key litmus test that people accept a religious settlement like Elizabeth's? Well, do they go to church or not? Do they refuse? And the vast majority of people continue to attend church relatively happily, and that's got to be evidence that they accepted that religious settlement, right? So if you are ever asked, why did Catholics accept the religious settlement, or how successful was it? I think these four reasons here are really good ones to look at if you need to explain that in the future. But it isn't just the situation in England that's important. I think if we're going to look at why the religious settlement is pretty successful, I think we also need to look at the attitudes of both the papacy, the Pope, and of foreign countries like France and Spain. So let's start with the papacy. In 1559, when Elizabeth shows her hand as a Protestant, she's going to establish a Protestant church. Most Catholics probably expected that Pope Pius IV would excommunicate Elizabeth immediately and call on England's Catholics to rise up and get rid of this Protestant heretic. But he doesn't. In fact, in 1559, for the whole really, or for a lot of the 1560s, the Pope does very little and offers very little leadership to England's Catholics. In fact, all he really does do is he kind of waits, 5-6 years until 1566, and then issues an instruction that England's Catholics should not attend Church of England services. And then later on, he sends an English Catholic exile, a guy called Lawrence Vaux, to kind of spread that message around England. But the impact of that message is pretty limited. And as before, most Catholics continue to attend their local Church of England parish church. So far, the Pope Pius IV had no real impact. But perhaps the major thing that does happen is that the following Pope, Pius V, in 1570 does take action and does excommunicate Elizabeth through what's called a papal bull, which is like an order, essentially. So it was like a great message where the Pope said to all Catholics in England, I release you from your loyalty to Elizabeth I, and you should now go and try and remove her from the throne. But this is 11 years after the religious settlement? 11 years is a long time, and by this point, the Pope has acted the papacy has acted far too late, because by not taking action immediately, the papacy has given Elizabeth's Church of England a whole decade to establish itself. It's had 10 years for people to kind of accept the church for the way it is. And ordinary English Catholics in England have developed a loyalty to Elizabeth. And so when the papal bull was released, it was largely ignored. So I think if we're looking for another key reason why the religious settlement is pretty successful and why Catholics don't really rise up against it and challenge it, it's because there was a lack of leadership from the papacy in the short term. And when the Pope Pius V did act and excommunicate Elizabeth in 1570, it largely fell on deaf ears. And in the end, no English Catholics really did anything of significance, of course, apart from those main plots against Elizabeth. What I'm talking about here are the sort of ordinary people, ordinary sort of lower class people did not take any real action. The last thing I want to look at then, before we sum up, is basically the attitude of foreign Catholic nations. So when Elizabeth was about to release her religious settlement for the first time, of course, it was the case that the foreign Catholic nations like France and Spain and the Holy Roman Empire would have been looking to England to see what Elizabeth was going to do. And arguably, there was always the threat that if she, as she did, of course, come out as a Protestant officially, then could there be a Catholic invasion? Could France and Spain and the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope all unite and there be a Catholic crusade into England? It seems fanciful, perhaps, but that was something that there was a risk of. And don't forget, of course, at the start of Elizabeth's reign, she is already at war with the French because of actions taken by Mary I and her government during her reign. So could there have been a Catholic invasion when Elizabeth came out as a Protestant? Well, in the end, there wasn't. And the reasons for this are basically that the other two had their reasons for not getting involved. So on the one hand, France was occupied with its own civil war in 1562. So the French Catholics and the French Protestants, called the Huguenots, were fighting against each other. And so the French didn't really have the time or resources to spend helping Catholics in England. So the French are pretty busy. They're not going to lend any help at the moment. You've also got Spain with its devout Catholic king, Philip II. Again, didn't really take any real action to start with. Why? Because Spain was still an English ally in 1559. You'll remember, I hope, that Philip II of Spain was married to Mary I of England. So politically, Spain and England are quite close in 1559. But even if relations were worse than they actually were at the start of Elizabeth's reign, Spain would not have wanted to replace Elizabeth at that stage, because Elizabeth's heir apparent was Mary, Queen of Scots, who was pro-French, given her marriage to the Dauphin, the French heir to the throne, in case you don't know what Dauphin means. And so that would have strengthened their rival, France. So politically, Spain had no real reason to support English Catholics against Elizabeth at this time. So, on the whole, what I've talked about in this video, basically Catholic opposition to Elizabeth's religious settlement. So I've said, on the one hand, there was some evidence of opposition. So in the short term, there was an immediate backlash from the Catholic clergy and some Catholic nobles in the House of Lords. So, as I mentioned before, all but one Catholic bishop resigned in protest to Elizabeth's religious settlement. Many Catholic nobles, approximately a third, became recusants. They refused to attend Elizabeth's church services. And after Mary, Queen of Scots, came to England in 1568, Catholic plotters would then use Mary as the focus for schemes against Elizabeth, such as in the Babington plot in 1586. But I would argue that really, after the religious settlement came about in 1558, 1559, actually most Catholics actually conformed to it. Most ordinary Catholics went to church and they continued to go to church, and they did not take part in any of the revolts or uprisings. And one of the key reasons for this is that actually no uprising or plot really ever gained a mass public support. And a big reason for that is that Walsingham's spy network kept information about these plots secret from the public, and so no one ever really knew about them at the time. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lack of foreign support from the papacy and from key countries like France and Spain. The papal bull of 1570 had little effect in England and largely fell on deaf ears. The English Catholics never really wavered in their loyalty to Elizabeth, and that's because the papacy did not take any action really to excommunicate Elizabeth until 1570, about a decade after the religious settlement. So that gave the religious settlement, 10 years to really embed itself in England, and for English Catholics to develop a political loyalty to Elizabeth. So when the Pope did say, go and overthrow your queen, English Catholics were like, no, we're fine with her. And as I said, a big reason for that is that the religious settlement itself and the features of the religious settlement placated Catholics. They kept Catholics happy because enforcement was relatively lenient, the appearance of the church remained relatively Catholic, and there were other things as well, like the wording of the Book of Common Prayer being ambiguous. So there were lots of reasons for Catholics to be happy with the religious settlement. So to sum up then, I've made another little knowledge organizer here, which you are welcome to steal, or you can pause the video whenever you like and just take some notes from this. But basically, this is my summary of this kind of key question over whether Catholics in England accepted the religious settlement. And as I've said, for me personally, I think most of them did accept the religious settlement. There was, of course, some opposition, but what I've done here is I've just given some key reasons why the majority of English Catholics accepted the settlement. And that's because of the four reasons down here: leadership, appearance, organisation, enforcement, and nationalism. But also the other key reasons was that the attitudes of foreign nations were quite important, and that therefore left England's Catholics without any kind of support or leadership in the short term. And then over those sort of 10 years until 1570, England's Catholics developed a political loyalty to Elizabeth. So that's been my summary of Catholic opposition to religious settlement. I hope you found that informative, and I will see you next time when I talk about Mary, Queen of Scots, and her arrival in England. Thanks very much.